A new era in American railroading began in the 1860s. It began not with new capitalist innovations, nor technological advances, which would come soon enough. It began when railroads redefined how wars would be fought, when railroads redefined battlefield tactics and strategies. It started with the delivery of the newly elected President Abraham Lincoln from his home state of Illinois to the nation's capital in Washington, D.C., and ended with tracks spanning the country from east to west. Even before he was president, Abraham Lincoln fully understood the importance of railroads and the role they would play in the economic growth of the country. He knew that the East and the West had to be connected in a way faster than wagon trains and more reliable than the telegraph. He had argued as a young lawyer on behalf of railroad interests for the right to cross rivers such as the Mississippi. And more than anyone else, he shared the vision of General Grenville Dodge, the engineering mastermind who would lead the Union Pacific to complete half of the transcontinental railroad. Lincoln shared Dodge's vision for a national transportation infrastructure based on railroads, an infrastructure absolutely necessary for growing the nation's markets and creating a common sense of one country. Ironically, the sense of one country that was being torn apart by the institution of slavery. When Lincoln was elected president in 1860, the South feared the worst. The black president would free the South's slaves. On December 20th, 1860, South Carolina seceded from the Union. 2 months later, the Confederate States of America was founded. Jefferson Davis became its president. 2 days later, the president-elect Abraham Lincoln left his beloved Springfield, Illinois, aboard a New York Central train, like this one, bound for Washington, D.C. He was on his way to be inaugurated as president of a country divided, a country at war with itself. As he departed Springfield, Illinois, he said these historic words: "I'm leaving you on an errand of national importance, attended, as you are aware, with considerable difficulties. Let us believe, as some poet has expressed it, behind the cloud the sun is still shining. I bid you an affectionate farewell." What was to follow was one of the most unusual train rides in American history. As the president-elect's train passed through the gray, cold Midwest, Lincoln, though besieged by death threats, made whistle-stop speeches as he went. But when Lincoln arrived in Philadelphia, he was introduced to the nation's best-known detective, Allan Pinkerton. Pinkerton had uncovered an assassination plot that was to unfold as the train passed through Baltimore. Pinkerton convinced Lincoln that he should slip into the nation's capital in the dark of night, thus thwarting the assassination plans. Lincoln agreed. Nevertheless, a detail of Union soldiers guarded the B&O line as it passed over its famous bridge near Harper's Ferry. In front of the presidential train, a handcart paved the way, testing the rail ahead. At last, the midnight ride was over, and Lincoln arrived in the nation's capital at the Baltimore and Ohio's rail station on February 23rd. On March 4th, Abraham Lincoln was sworn in as the 16th President of the United States. On April 12th, Confederates fired on Fort Sumter in Charleston, South Carolina. The bloodiest war in American history had begun. 1 month later, the Confederates' most valiant general, Stonewall Jackson, stormed the Baltimore and Ohio facilities at Harper's Ferry. Jackson destroyed the railroad bridge across the Potomac and also captured 56 locomotives, destroying all but 14, which he took away. He also destroyed many miles of track and burned over 300 cars, essentially crippling the B&O for a year. General Jackson seemed to have been the only high-ranking officer in the Confederacy who understood the importance railroads would eventually play and who would win the Civil War. When the war broke out, the North had 3 times as much track laid as the South. Indeed, the Pennsylvania and the Erie railroads combined were larger than all the South's railroads. And what track the South had were of much lighter gauge, unable to move heavy equipment, horses, and men. Plus, many were in disrepair. Further, the South's disdain for mechanical pursuits had led to only minor investments in railroad manufacturing. As the conflict broke out, for the first time ever, railroads would play a decisive role in the war. The critical steps occurred in 1862, when Abraham Lincoln pushed through Congress bold legislative acts. One of their purposes was to create a railway line connecting the East with California. The Transcontinental Railroad, which would finally be completed in 1869. But the acts also gave the government authority to seize and control any of the northern states' railroads in order to move massive numbers of troops to critical battlefronts. And it allowed for the creation of new military track and facilities. By the war's end, Lincoln's railroad consisted of over 2,000 miles of line, 419 locomotives, and more than 6,000 cars. The legislation also gave the military authority to run captured Southern railroad facilities, something the North effectively did. In fact, General Sherman's famous march through the South was more of a train ride through the South. Before General Sherman began the famous March to the Sea, he trained 10,000 troops in railroad repair. His troops became so adept at repair of tracks that the rail lines, destroyed by the South as they retreated, would often be in service within a day, if not the same day. What has been dubbed by some railroad historians as President Lincoln's Railroad became the most important weapon in the North's arsenal leading to its victory in 1865.
Hi, I'm Bill Ambrose. If you like this video, subscribe so we can bring you more programming from our studio. Thank you for subscribing.